Okay, hi, this is the Excellence Podcast. I'm Miles. Good morning. Today, yesterday we had a conversation and I talked about this notion of using our mind and reason and rationality in a way where we can observe the world and make informed decisions about it. Basically, science. The ability to make observations, to be able to create hypotheses, to test them, and then to then make the observations of those tests to validate whether it's correct or not. And then we also have this willingness to do work, this ability of industry, this ability to want to do things. And then we have passion. We have this heart that exists. And when we look at any one of them in isolation, of course there are ways in which they break down. And we want to blend all three, each within a proper measure, to apply them in a way that brings out the best outcome for the future. And this is really, excellence is not always an extreme in something. In athletics, yes, there's those that can go to the highest level, but in everyday life, excellence often comes in blending balances. And so, in order to do that, I thought I'd approach the next few episodes of this podcast along the lines of those three areas, and in refining the mind and the way that we observe things. I want to talk about fallacies. I want to talk about logical fallacies. Going forward, when we talk about industry, hey, I was a people manager and a resource coach for a long time, and there really is a lot to that is about being productive, being engaged, and being involved. And we'll talk about that too. That's more of the work-life balance discussions and the creations around effectiveness and efficiency. So we'll get to that. I mean, that's going to be another part. And then comes that passion part, the heart part, the emotional intelligence part, the understanding ourselves and how we, being emotional creatures, can not just engage in that, but we could bring that to the table as this tremendous opportunity and this great thing, this great possibility we can use. But today I want to talk about fallacies. Now, I love fallacies. I was introduced to fallacies. Actually, I was introduced to fallacies originally in high school, but I really came to understand them in college. I took a philosophy of logic course. It was one of the courses that you needed to take in order to be a computer scientist at that time. And the philosophy of logic basically comes down to a process of looking at life looking at language and looking at interaction through a process of cause and effect, where you take the neutrality of the thing and you say, okay, so we're gonna take, we'll use a very easy one. I have a white Lexus, and there are other people who have white Lexuses. Therefore, all Lexuses are white. Well, okay, so that falls apart because obviously not all Lexuses are white, and there are people who have non-white Lexuses. But there's this idea that we could be able to take this and neutralize it. We could neutralize the concept. So we could take it and say, okay, X has a white Y. Multiple X's have a white Y. Therefore, all Y's are white. Well, it's you get into that X and Y, you start removing the language, you start removing, excuse me, you start removing the various details of it, and you can begin to tie out the English language into these logical constructs, basically making them into math equations. And this was really fascinating. It was a really interesting class for me. I really enjoyed that. That being said, I also had a notion which was slightly. I also had the part of the class was going over fallacies, and now fallacies I love. Fallacies are really amazing, and I think that fallacies are something that everyone should know about And if you don't, then this is going to be great. And if you do, you should be reminded, because honestly, even going back and looking back at this, at the information that I was going to do to put this together, I had forgotten. I mean, if you want to know how many fallacies there are, go to the Wikipedia page. Go to Wikipedia and look up fallacies, logical fallacies. There are 100 of them listed there. Now, they're variations on a theme in a lot of cases, and some of them are have more modern connotations, and they come in and they're different expressions of other things. But there's some old core basics that are good, and I'm going to cover a few today, just because I don't know how long it's going to take to cover them. I only have a certain amount of time. So, fallacies. Now, a couple of things about fallacies first. Fallacies are one of those areas where the balance between passion and reason gets exploited. There's a way in which we feel about conclusions, and the way we feel about the way that things go from cause into effect. And the use of that feeling, remember, emotions are an optimization to the human brain. Emotions, one of the roles of emotions is to make it so we don't have to rationally think through every possible thing we're doing. I don't want to have to spend my life, and we have a lot of things that are automatic. I mean, you have stuff that's subconsciously automatic, like breathing. I don't want to actively have to think, okay, inhale now so that I can say more words, and then I'm going to run out of words. Am I out of breath now yet? No, not yet. Okay, still going. I can still do that. Oh, wait, now I'm getting low. Okay, I'm starting to feel the tingly sensation that tells me that I'm running out of air. Okay, I got to do something. Oh, okay, breathe in. I have 100,000 things going on in my brain that are just getting me to move. Bouncing my head around causes me to do 1,000 micro thoughts. I don't want to actively have to work those. So I need an optimization system. I need optimization systems in my brain to allow me to do things actively and do things, I'm going to use the term subconsciously, but I hope you know what I mean. We're going to do them with a conscious effort, and we're going to do them with a subconscious effort. And the subconscious things are optimizations. They make it so that we do things well and we optimize our behavior. Emotions leverage some of this. Some of the work that emotions do is they leverage and create the fuel or the motive or the inspiration for some of the optimizations that we're going to look at. So fallacies are one of those cases where the balance of that optimization actually creates a reasonable or a logical breakdown. It creates a situation where it tears apart, or it actually makes something seem as though it follows in a rational observation when it actually doesn't. When it actually is leveraging some kind of optimization, some kind of emotional optimization, some kind of short circuit, usually, in order to make it so that we either accept an untruth as truth, or we allow the emotional short circuit to be the evidence for truth, rather than anything that's actually related to the subject. So, let's get started. What do we have here for our first candidate? We have the ad hominem. Okay, the ad hominem is the most common fallacy you find in politics. It's the one. Ad hominem means at the man. So you're basically saying, all right, over exaggerated example. Adolf Hitler said once that the color of his car was black. I'm using the color of the car analogy a lot today. But Adolf Hitler... Oh, actually, let's just turn this around. So Hitler said that child education is a very important thing, and that we need to invest heavily in child education because caring for children is what is very important in our society. Well, but Adolf Hitler ran concentration camps, so we can't listen to him on. I mean, he was responsible for tremendous numbers of deaths of children. So we can't listen to him on whether the argument is valid or not. Well, this is an ad hominem scenario where what he says may or may not be true, but we're basing our statement of whether it is true or not based on the person who said it. And that's a problem. There's a form of ad hominem. I may be mistaking this with appeal to authority, but the other ad hominem manifestation is this is my argument, and then you turn around and say, yes, but you're a jerk. You're stupid. But you do these other things. The famous one with your parents. Do as I say, not as I do. Well, there's this idea that your parents are stupid because you're young and you don't know any better. So why would I listen to a stupid person on something? So it's basically looking at the person instead of looking at the actual effect of it's looking at the person, and I'm probably misspeaking these things, these fallacies. I'm going off a little bit of memory here, and I apologize. I probably should have done more research. So basically appealing to the person, saying, you are this kind of way, and you are a bad person, therefore your argument is bad. You're seeing this a lot right now. Almost any claim right now, racism, is being used that way. We're not arguing pro or con whether somebody is or is not a racist. We're basically saying you are, and therefore, regardless of that truth, whatever you say, therefore, is obviously erroneous. And that just is silly. I mean, whether they are or are not a racist, or a sexist, or any other derogatory term you want to use, if they say 2 + 2 is 4, it still is true. And so we have to be careful, and we associate. And the way the emotions work here is the argument is you judge people based on various qualities. You judge people based on their reputation, based on the content of them as a person. And so you will learn to trust those that you believe to be trustworthy. Well, trustworthiness is an emotional environment. And so if we can go in and shove a wedge right into that trust paradigm, then it can begin to cause you to engage in suspicion. And often, emotionally, when we end up in a case where we're looking at something as suspicion, we default, or some people will default to a rejection of a notion, just because. And I'm not saying that it's a rejection as in evil, bad. No, but I am saying that your brain will basically wire and say, I don't. Let's look more carefully at that. Now, that's a good thing. In normal circumstances, we should look suspiciously at people with odd reputations. But then we go too far, and we step it into the realm of saying the statement there. We take the short circuit. And this is how that short circuit works. We need to look at suspicion. Therefore, rather than look at it with suspicion and evaluate it on its own merits, we say, it comes from a suspicious source. Therefore, we're going to automatically short circuit and jump to false. We're going to jump to don't listen. And this is really problematic. This becomes really interesting when you look at studying other philosophers. I was involved with a number of friends of mine. We were all reading Nietzsche, and it was fascinating to see how much emotion got involved in the man himself. Ayn Rand is another one. You look at people that get emotionally involved in the demonization of the person rather than the ideas and notions that they're saying. The number of people I know that reject Ayn Rand or Nietzsche who've never read either is really amazing, is really interesting. It's like studying a person instead of studying their work. It's studying who a person is rather than what they're saying. And like I said, this is valuable. This has a place. There is a goodness to this paradigm. It's just not in determining whether something's true or not. So there you sit with the ad hominem fallacy. Be careful of it, and you'll see it in politics all the time. I mean, look at all the name calling. All you have to do is whenever you get into any kind of name calling or any kind of well, yeah, but you believe this, or but you're this kind of person. well, wait a minute, you're not talking about the argument, you're not debating the subject. You've moved the subject over to the character of the person. And that's really that's the trick. And the trick is there. So it is actively used by politicians quite frequently. Know it, see it. And when you see it, don't hate the politician that's doing it. Don't then do this and say, oh, you're using an ad hominem fallacy, therefore you're evil. And therefore I can't listen to you. Then you're doing the exact same thing. Don't do that. What this is, recognize that it's happening and then tease out the effect that that's happening on your evaluation of what something's being said, whether it's true or not. Because the key part here, especially when we come into cases, I mean, we've got an election coming up, so I've got politics on the brain. I apologize. We've got subjects coming up that need to be considered, that need to be evaluated. And unfortunately, the people that I have to listen to for my evaluations are people who are going to want to persuade me emotionally to make decisions over wanting to be persuaded by reason. And when people are trying to persuade me emotionally, I fall for it sometimes. I mean, I'm a passionate person. I have my own things that I'm really passionate about. I want to be there. And so I'm just as vulnerable as anybody. But when I see that we're getting into an ad hominem situation, when I'm getting into, and this is why I really can't look at political campaigns, political ads, because of one person talking about their opponent. I really can't look at that. I got to go kind of look at other things. I got to kind of go look at their own world, because a lot of it is just demonization. That's no fun. I mean, it's even gotten bad where I can't even go to regular news agencies anymore. I have to go to special places to go find my information, and it's really annoying. But I recognize these are ad hominem attacks, and once I recognize it's an ad hominem attack, then I can set it in its proper place. I don't discard what's being said, but I do remove it from the relevance of the discussion that I'm interested in and what's going on. So there's the first one. Moving on to the next, we have the straw man. Okay, so the straw man is it's another fun one. This one is where you start adding things. You start making people bigger than they are. You start giving them things that they're not saying. I get this a lot. People give me a lot of this. In my role as manager, a lot of people assumed my motives and would add my motives on. Because I made no bones about it. I am a representative of the company. My job is to represent the company's interests, but that doesn't mean that I don't have your interests in mind as well. I am a manager, and as a manager, if I have a team that is doing well, and if I'm building that team well, and if I'm working well with that, then the company's getting what they need. The company is getting a great asset and good use of its money. In the meantime, one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that you're taken care of or take care of you. So there's this assumption that I made no bones about it. I even said, I'm a company man. I represent the company. Of course I do. Someone has to. One of us has to. So I might as well be the one that does that. But I used to get things would add things on. They'd add motives to me. They'd add things that weren't mine, and then they would add things that weren't true, and then they would knock it down. So they're not arguing with my argument. They're arguing with the extra. They're arguing with something added to. So straw man argument in that context, if I would say, I need to keep an eye on our expenditures. So I would like to make sure that we have proper planning for our vacation time. So I would like notice of vacations that you're planning on taking in the next 3 months. And someone would turn around, and there might, there's a hypothetical. This never happened, but I'm giving it to illustrate the case. Someone turns around and says, "Well, actually, you're being unreasonable. You're asking for us to give you information on this because you're actually trying to manipulate us so that you can build a schedule so you can get the most out of us, because you just want us to minimize our overtime and make sure that we don't that we're they're there because you don't really care about us. You only care about the company dollar." Okay, now a lot of what was said there is actually true. I do care about overtime. I do care about vacation time. I do care about keeping everybody's sanity in play, and I do care about getting the most for the company. But when they say that I don't care about them, that's one straw too far. And now they're able to beat up that subject because that's not true. That's not me. And so giving me these additional motives, it's just as much to focus the motives into a certain language as it is to ignore the rest of the case. My favorite piece about the straw man, the straw man is when it inflates so big that it becomes no longer true. And that is when people start giving you things. They give you things that are not your own. And this is a really interesting notion in emotions when you get into the emotional paradigm. Because when you're looking at the emotional paradigm, taking on things that other people give you that isn't yours is a really interesting paradigm. Because there may be a notion that emotionally, and speaking how the straw man works emotionally, if you turn around and say, okay, so you're making all these premises, you're making all these statements, about my argument or about me, you're taking things to the next step, you're making things bigger than they are, you're adding things that I'm not saying, and then you begin to tear down what you added. There is a notion of goodwill in conversation, that each person that we're talking to is actually, to a certain extent, interested in our behalf, at least in having a civil and reasonable conversation. Unfortunately, the straw man argument is in violation of that rule. And so what ends up happening is you end up building up this argument to be a bigger case than it actually is, and then it becomes wrong, and then you can attack all the rest of this stuff, and it becomes easy to attack. It becomes easy to knock down. But we emotionally, because we already interpret a certain amount of goodwill just in the nature of conversation, we are willing to associate that their logical connections of the straw man's largeness are valid. And as such, everything attached to it, it all becomes attached together, and therefore if we can invalidate any part of it, we can invalidate the whole. Now, even that is a fallacy of a different sort, and that's not true either. But this is one of those cases where you just want to watch out and say, am I taking on stuff that isn't mine? Is this moving beyond the scope of what we're talking about or what we're thinking about? And when I'm talking about these fallacies, these are very specific things. I mean, lawyers will do brilliant things with this. I mean, fallacies are both a tool for and against in argument and political discourse and in debate. But one of the things that I really look to is, how does it undermine ourselves? How do we get undermined in the process, and how does that work? And the big worry I have with the straw man is that we take on stuff that isn't ours. We take on things that we don't own. And this is something that happens a lot. And often we take it on because it either comes from somebody that we respect, or comes from someone whose opinion of us is, or opinion of the way that they think is really mature. We have a great deal of respect and admiration for the way that they process things. And so we listen to them, and then we kind of make an assumption in that short-circuiting way. Again, just as in the ad hominem, when you can short-circuit and say this person's a not trustworthy person, therefore his argument's probably false. In the straw man case, if you're working with somebody who you do trust and who does have a logic, we begin to second guess ourselves. But the reality is we're moving beyond the subject. We need to recognize that we've moved out of the scope of what we're actually talking about and get back into it and understand what of what is being argued is actually relevant to what I'm talking about versus what isn't. All right. So, moving on, we have the appeal to ignorance. Okay. I made a promise to myself on this thing that I wasn't going to talk politics or religion. And here I am looking at things that it's like ad hominem is a huge politics, straw man is a huge political thing. Appeal to ignorance is my favorite religious argument. I just can't win today. All right. So appeal to ignorance. This is that notion that if you can't prove it's false, then it must be true. Or if you can't prove it's true, then it's got to be false. The appeal to ignorance is an incomplete argument. It's a fallacy of incompleteness. And it's the truth of it is, if you can't prove something is true, then the thing you can say about it is I can't prove it's true. You can't make a definitive statement as to whether it is true or not. You can only state that you cannot prove it's true. The same is true for falseness. I cannot prove it as false, therefore I cannot prove it as false. Because whether you can prove or disprove the truth or falseness of a thing actually is not related to the truth or falseness of a thing. But when you take the inverse of that, ignorance is a statement of something we don't know. But if you take a statement of what you do know, you can prove truth within the boundaries of what you have. So you can say, so you have this thing, and of course the both the atheist and the religious minded, the atheist and the deist, for purposes of generalizing the terms. Each one, when they use an appeal to ignorance, is falling short of the mark of making a valid argument, of making a logically sound argument. So the atheist says there's no proof that God exists, therefore God cannot exist. That's appeal to ignorance. The aliens, too. You get the aliens argument. There is no proof that aliens don't exist, therefore aliens must exist. I actually had fun with aliens. I had a friend of mine. I went over to a friend of mine's house on Friday, and we were watching Ancient Aliens. Now, I don't watch television very often. I'm usually spending most of my time traveling or working or talking with people. So I prefer interpersonal interaction. And when I do my travel, I get most of my entertainment from listening to books while on the road. And so I haven't watched television in a long time. And watching Ancient Aliens was interesting because here's these long strings of supposition. I mean, there are different fallacies that are actually there. It's if we can frame this image of here are these really, really strange things that aren't explained very easily or very well in other areas. But if we bring them all together under this thing and we create an exact right form, we can say, this is a likely outcome. That's a really interesting argument. And now I want to do the experiment. I want to go back and watch an episode of Ancient Aliens and see if I can apply all the logical fallacies and see if I can deconstruct it. Ooh, that would be fun. Oh, I'm gonna have to do that one day. Anyway, so but the whole premise is that the whole premise of that particular show is that humans were influenced by aliens and we're looking for the evidence of it. And the argument that comes in is that it's got to be possible. I mean, nobody's proved that aliens don't exist. I mean, look at all the stars, all the space, and all the rest of it. There's got to be something out there, and we have no proof that there's nothing else out there. Well, wait a minute. No proof that you don't have something isn't proof that you have anything. So this is that appeal to ignorance. And it comes up every now and then. It comes up as it's not used as often now in my older years as it was when I was a kid. And Monty Python actually uses it in a lot of their sketches. Well, you can't say it's not that way. Well, okay. So does that move us along? So appeal to ignorance. It's a fallacy there. It is the way that it operates emotionally. The way that I think it operates emotionally. Is it feeds on our curiosity. We have within us an innate curiosity that makes some of us, the bolder of us, the adventurous of us, want to go and explore, want to go and see other things, want to go and find other things, want to go and be part of other places. Why does a person go over the mountain? Because go see what's on the other side. We have an innate curiosity, and that innate curiosity relies on there being a whole realm of possible outcomes, a whole realm of possible things that we could imagine. We're imaginative creatures. We invent amazing things. And if you want to doubt that, hear a bump in the night and go walk through your house with none of the lights on and a baseball bat because you're worried about what's there, and think about all the crazy possibilities of things that are showing up. When I lived with my grandmother, when I got out of the army, I lived with my grandmother. And I spent a year working there. It was very strange because she had a 2-story house, and I didn't know what her regular schedules were or anything along those lines. So I would stay up until midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. And I was in this little cubby. My grandfather had a workshop underneath the stairs. And I set up my computer and everything in that workshop, and I used to work down there, and I could hear people walking around upstairs at 1 o'clock in the morning. And when I first moved in, this really caught me off guard. And I was right out of the army, so I wasn't afraid of anything. So I went over and I grabbed hold of a baseball bat and a knife and walked upstairs to go see what was going on and take care of the house. Well, as you can imagine, if you've ever lived with some elderly folk, she was up wandering around getting herself a glass of milk or something. And we came around the corner, and she startled the hell out of me. I startled the hell out of her. But all of the things that were going through my mind as to what it could possibly be and what I would do and how I would interact with it. This is part of our natural processes. We imagine. When we're under threat, we imagine the risks. When we're bored, we imagine the possibilities. If you ever want to understand why there's so much story about astrology and so much mythology in astrology, go up. If you live, my parents live in the country, so I would go up on the roof and I would get up on top. And it was really important that it was in the country because I also live in the city and I don't see many stars in the city. But out in the country, I would sit on the roof and you could look up and you could see all these stars all the time. And, we'd point out constellations and we'd look at this and point out that. Now imagine that you have no books. Your weather is okay. The sun goes down. It's the only show in town, those stars. And so the imagination kicks in, and you end up seeing this thing and filling it full of all these amazing ideas and all these amazing stories. And it's the same show for everybody. We all see the same stars. And so a culture will create their paradigms and create that. And it becomes a study. It becomes, really important. People knew what stars were in what position at what time of year because it was the TV show. It was the program. It was such an important part. And in an agrarian society, agrarian culture, times and dates, times of years are kind of important. So we have this imagination. And this imagination likes to be utilized. And when we talk about the appeal to ignorance, when we say, well, you can't say that this is true, this isn't true, our brain says, oh, you're right. We can't say that. I don't have the disproof. And then our brain begins to imagine all of the possibilities. We want us to have more opportunities and possibilities. It's fun to consider. It's fun to think about. That's why some of these shows, I know people that have the most rational, most critical, scientific mind ever that watch the most crap shows. Yeah, they even acknowledge it. They even acknowledge it. Look, this is terrible. This is just horrible. And they're just watching it anyway. And why? Because it's fun to imagine. And this is part of that. So we have this acceptance of a willingness to open ourselves to new ideas. And this acceptance kind of twists a little bit to saying, well, if I can accept that we can have these new ideas, then I can accept this as a possible truth. The jump where we go too far is when we say, can we accept it as a possible truth? Yes. Can we accept it as a truth? No. And that's where the breakdown happens. Again, it's one of those short circuits that skips too far. So the next one and the last one I want to talk about today is going to be the false dichotomy. Okay. This one's my favorite because I see this happen all the time in my consulting. I was part of a 4-person panel on HR Today, and there was a guy on there that was saying, well, do you think X is true or Y is true? And I kept saying, I don't think that those two are related. I think there's a false dichotomy. And so the false dichotomy is when you set a black and white circumstance, when there's a whole lot of gray. That's one form of the false dichotomy. Another form of the false dichotomy is to set, and I don't know whether there's false dichotomy. I know the black and white and there's a lot of gray. False dichotomy thing is definitely true. The question on the other one of, so there's this other form that I run into, which I call the false dichotomy, and I may be calling it the wrong thing. And that's when, we're going to put A and B as a black and white choice when actually there's no continuum. There's no relation. There's a false interpretation of a relation. And this is one of those cases where it's kind of a trap. You get gated, and mentalists will use this quite often. Your brain likes to solve puzzles, and it enjoys puzzles. And the simpler the puzzle, the more it wants to engage in it, or the nicer it is. Now, complex problems are a different thing. It's a different emotional paradigm there. But simple choices, we like simple choices. My favorite Batman bad guy is Two-Face. And I loved in Arkham Asylum, which was a graphic novel that I read on a friend's couch one evening, many years ago. They have this wonderful thing where Two-Face is this character. And if you're not familiar with Two-Face, Two-Face is one of the bad guys. He had a horrible accident where he was burned and crushed. And he was made a monster on half of his face. And Harvey Dent, he used to be a lawyer. And so what he does is he has a coin. It's a two-headed coin. It's got scratched up side and a clean side. And he resolves all his decisions down to binary decisions. And then he flips his coin. And whatever the coin comes up with, that's his decision. Do I kill you or do I let you go? Flip a coin, whatever the coin says, that's his decision. And that was one of the things that made him really terrifying. And in Arkham Asylum is the asylum where all the bad guys in Batman end up going. They are all crazy and psychotic, so they all end up going to this insane asylum called Arkham. And in Arkham Asylum, in this one episode, you have a case, or in this one book, you have a case where Batman gets captured. The inmates are running the asylum. They've overtaken it. And Batman gets captured, and he's on trial. Now, they ask Batman how he wants to do it. And they say, well, I want Two-Face to be my judge. And they all said, this is not possible. This really isn't, you're not able to do this. He's been changed. And what happened was his psychological treatment was that they tried to give him more choices. So they went from his coin, they took away his binary choice, and they gave him a small die, a 6-sided die. And he had to make 6 decisions, 6 choices. And then he would roll the die and he'd do that. And the idea was he could see things in a non-binary way, and that would treat him. And eventually they built up with more and more choices, and then they eventually gave him a deck of cards. And here he was sitting here with this entire house of cards built on a table, just staring at it, because he couldn't come up with 52 options. And so it stagnated him and stopped. And they said, he's crazy. He'll never do anything. So Batman pulls out his old Two-Face's old coin, flips it to him. Two-Face grabs the coin, flips it in the air, smashes all the cards, looks at the coin, says, he lives. And none of the people in the insane asylum could argue with the logic. So here was this idea. The false dichotomy, though, that's my favorite. He's my favorite bad guy. I love that entire story. Thank you for letting me tell it. But he relies on his evilness. Actually, relies on the concept of a false dichotomy. That there are binaries, but we enjoy binaries. Binaries are wonderful to our short-circuiting mind because we like being able to just choose between two things. One of the most stagnating things that happens is looking at a menu because there are so many choices to look at. And often we will limit it to our menu in our head, which is the 3 or 4 things that we are interested in versus the huge array of options. And this was really illustrated to me on a friend of mine who came over from England, and they were there, and you go to McDonald's and what do you want? I said, well, I don't know what the options are. I haven't looked at her. Go to Taco Bell, or I think in this case it was Taco Bell, and she just had never been exposed to it, so she'd never looked at a menu. But the one she was with had like the rest of us, is so familiar with the menu, they'd already short-circuited it down to their 2 or 3 options and had made their choice instantly. But if you walk into a restaurant for the first time, you have a huge array of options, and it's stressful. You've got people waiting for you. You're trying to move things along, and it's really interesting to watch the effect that has on the brain. And the reason why I bring that up is because the more complex it is, the more stress we start to experience. And our emotional response to stress is to reduce it. And so we want to short circuit to a reduction of stress. So we like when we get down to 1 or 2 options. It's pleasant. And so we lock ourselves into those 1 or 2 options. And this is one of those things where someone is framing a binary decision, and we're engaging in that binary decision. We're taking it on and we're accepting it as our own. And that's okay in most cases, but the step, again, that step that's too far in the optimization is when we rush to the assumption that we agree with the binary framework. When we don't challenge the binary framework in our own understanding, then we fall into this paradigm of wanting there to be a binary framework, and then we select from one of the 2 choices, and then we're locked into 2 choices that aren't even our own, or 2 choices that we don't necessarily think are valid, or 2 choices that don't encompass the full range of possibilities. And so the false dichotomy is one. Excuse me. The false dichotomy is one that I keep finding time and time again when people want me to enter into a certain framework of thinking, I find false dichotomies a lot. There's kind of I have a solution and I'm going to create the binary paradigm that makes my solution the right one. I don't like this because I think that there's so much in my environment. Context makes all the difference. Just because you have a good strategy, or you have a good technique, or you have a good policy, or you have a good tool to use, it doesn't mean it's useful in all cases for all things. And I work in an environment in the coaching business. There are a lot of people that are trying to push their version, their thing, and it's a easier sell. You can find clients that want to buy your product rather than people that want to buy your consultation, because there's a relevance to everything in my case. And when I'm looking at things, I can't operate with neutrality. I can operate from various contexts. I can say these are what things have benefited in my life, or these are things that have benefited in my career. These are things that have benefited in my company. in the given context that they have. But I have to conditionalize the hell out of it in my own thinking in order to ensure that I'm not closing down things. Like, for example, I ran into many tools in my management career that were not useful in those contexts. Does that mean that those tools are not useful? No. It means that that tool in that context was not useful. And so I have to I have to keep the context of the situation open. And this is the real challenge, because false dichotomy, once you move it to a binary, you're removing context. You're removing nuance. You're removing relevance in some cases. And you can still dial down to a binary and not have a false dichotomy. That is possible. You can agree to set parameters where we're going to reduce this down to 1 or 2 decisions. But this isn't an automatic. This is something that takes work. It's something that requires a bit of effort. And so this is really a problem I have. It's my favorite fallacy because it's the one I run into the most. And it's honestly the one that I think people fall into in their own trap of thinking, that when they're thinking things on their own without talking to people, when they come up with their own ideas, when they rationalize their own philosophies, and they don't put them to the test, they don't talk to people about them, they don't engage with people that may not agree, they don't allow it to be challenged, then you can run into these cases where you start to simplify the conversation down to binaries, just because it's easier to have the conversation then, and it's easier to reinforce the things you already believe. And again, so we will use false dichotomies on ourselves. And this is a real interesting trick. In fact, that's an interesting point to bring up here at the end, since those are the 4 that I'm covering today. These are interesting things to note when we use them against ourselves. And training yourself to be aware of them is probably a good thing. The ad hominem can teach us to allow us to remove our opinion from a person from the evaluation of ideas. And this is when you engage in things like the way you're going to vote. Getting back to the politics thing, the way you're going to vote. Are you voting because of how you feel about a person, or are you voting because you have a few principled ideas about how things should be done and what you think is best for your community and your society, and that the one you're voting for, the policy you're voting for, is most closely aligned to what you think is the best, most kind, most beneficial, and most civil outcome for society in general? And when you run into someone who challenges those, do you understand the challenges? Because the reality is there is no one solution, and every solution has its flaws. Know your own. Know the limits of your own philosophy. Know the limits of what you're doing, and then use that in a way to make an informed decision. The binary is nice. The binary is made for you. There's only so many choices on the ballot. So you get to make the binary, and that's nice and easy. But know why you're making the binary choice you're making. And have reason. Have a reason to. We have this amazing mind. And we live in an amazing place where you can use it, you can expand it, and you can act on what happens. You can act on your thoughts, especially during, election season. But know when you're discrediting an idea because of who has the idea. Know that. Know when that goes on in your head. Evaluate when you start blowing things out of proportion. When you start expanding the boundaries of what you actually are talking about. And know that when you throw something down, when you tear something down, I guess the piece to look at internally on the straw man that I would come to is when you reject something, be careful not to reject everything. Reject what needs to be rejected. Because it may be that there is additional baggage strapped to a good idea, and you're rejecting the baggage, but the good idea gets lost in the throw. That's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Let's try to avoid that. Be aware of that. Be imaginative and enjoy life and enjoy exploration and enjoy considering the possibilities. But be careful of making the assumption that something is true because it can't be disproven. That's not really an argument for truth. That's just an argument for whether proof exists, whether proof is sufficient or exists. That's all it's an argument for. And the false dichotomy, we talked a lot about that. I enjoy breaking down the false dichotomy, and I actually use it. I actually use looking at that false binary as a great way of knowing when something went horribly wrong. If someone sets up a binary paradigm for me, my first reaction is to try to figure out exactly why or exactly where that breaks down, because I have run into very, very few absolute binaries when it comes to talking about humans, when it comes to talking about life or being engaged in work, when it comes to talking about relationships, when it comes to talking about emotions. The world's not that simple. And we can define it that simply using language, but it rarely actually just bounces out to be that simple, that we're a binary, unless we agree to limit ourselves to a binary with given limitation rules. It's hard to recognize whether that's going to be there or not, because I don't see it very often. I don't see a real binary choice. But in argumentation, there are a lot of people that like to use binary choices in order to make their point. So there you go. There are some fallacies, some things to think about. My intention here, again, is just to get just to illustrate how amazing our minds are, and to illustrate the way that they interact, and the back and forth and the play on these. Now, don't hold me to being a philosophical scholar. I'm not, and I probably have made a number of mistakes. I encourage you to go and look stuff up on your own. Go and study the fallacies. Go and find your own way of doing it. We'll talk about some more, because I'm enjoying the conversation of exploring the emotional mechanic behind why it works, which I think is a fascinating aspect, and I think it's insightful. But go and look at these for yourself. And, if I'm wrong, tell me. I mean, options to make all kinds of comments. I did want to do a last plug. I do have a Patreon. It'll show up on the closing credits here. I have a Discord channel on which I am happy to spend some time chatting. Anytime I'm working, I'm usually on Discord. I do a lot of travel, so I'm not on Discord when I'm on the road. But when I'm sitting at my desk and I'm working on it, I'm on Discord. a $1 donation will definitely get you in the Discord. That's the gig. Just want to have, I'd love to have your participation. Love to chat with you. Love to talk to you. Love to know what you want to talk about. I'm open to suggestions. So, that. You've got that. My LinkedIn's on the thing. So if you're interested in a little private consultation, I'm open to that too. At any event, I think I'll wrap it here. This is the Excellence Podcast. It's been great talking to you. I'll talk to you tomorrow.